In the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, the Tyranids are an ever-present threat. From their initial invasion from beyond the edges of the galaxy with the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth, to the endless tendrils and splinter fleets that comprised Hive Fleet Kraken, the extragalactic bug swarm had become a constant enemy of the Imperium. But the third great invasion, named Leviathan, would threaten the very center of its power. The Imperium's first and second Tyranic Wars against the Hive fleets of Behemoth and then Kraken was separated by 250 years, during which the authorities of the Imperium had grown complacent, chalking Behemoth up to just another short-lived Xenos invasion put down by the mighty armies of the Emperor. With the arrival of Kraken in the early 990s M41 and its shattering into hundreds of separate tendrils and splinter fleets after the Battle of Icar 4 in 993, the Imperium started to realise that it would never be free of the Tyranid menace, that the bioships and Hive fleets would continue to arrive, but they never realised that the next major assault would come so quickly or be so powerful. Again, other smaller Hive fleets have been spotted in the intervening years. In 995, Hive Fleet Jormungandr had enveloped Imperial systems on the eastern fringe, but rather than charging headlong, it fired endless small asteroids loaded with bioforms into the nearby planets, slowly seeding its organisms and overtaking them one at a time. The Imperial Navy was forced to ally with smaller Xenos empires to force it back. Jormungandr was evidence that the Great Hive Mind was evolving its strategy, but in 997, an even more worrying development occurred. Various worlds across the galactic south, but otherwise scattered far apart from each other, started to drop out of contact. Recognizing the telltale signs of a potential Tyranid attack, the now Lord Inquisitor Cryptman, the same that had discovered the Tyranids centuries earlier, enacted a great census. He burned out hundreds of astropaths in an attempt to contact every Imperial system that lay on the edge of the intergalactic void and ascertain if they were lost or under attack, and what he found was worrying. A new Hive fleet had already begun its assault on the Imperium, but rather than enter the galactic plane from the east as Behemoth and Kraken had, this one was attacking from underneath, in the form of multiple huge tendrils. Systems had already been lost as these huge tendrils pushed upwards into the galaxy, closing like a set of jaws around the segmentums Ultima, Tempestus, and even Solar, and casting a shadow in the warp light years wide between them. The entire underside of the galactic plane was practically invisible, lost to the darkness of the Hive fleet. He christened this new assault Leviathan, as reports started to roll in of desperate last stands against hordes of chittering beasts. The worlds of Valador and St. Capelline had already been lost, and the Hive tyrant bioform known as the Swarm Lord was sighted again in the Hodor sector, where the invading swarm destroyed Talon, homeworld of the Storm Falcons chapter. Battle Fleet Ultima was ambushed by two Tyranid fleets in the Bloodstar sector, taking punishing losses, and on the eastern fringe, the Adeptus Mechanicus was forced to abandon its research planet of Tesla Prime, which lay directly in the path of one of the jaws of Leviathan. Immediately after their departure, the planet was briefly occupied by orcs who had great fun with the various experimental weapons that had been left lying around, particularly when the Hive fleets arrived and they had something to try them out on. The chaos emboldened other Hive fleets. In the far northeast, Hive Fleet Moloch devoured some minor Xenos empires on the far side of the Gould Stars and pushed forward into the Imperium, and Hive Fleet Medusa invaded the ice world of Shadrach, the Space Wolves chapter fighting to stall its advance before eventually having to abandon the planet. Cryptman knew that the main jaws of Leviathan would have to be stopped somewhere, and the first opportunity came when the Hive fleets reached the world of Tarsis Ultra. Defended by the Ultramarines' 4th Company, commanded by Uriel Ventris, the defenders initially fared badly against the oncoming horde, until the Adeptus Mechanicus Magos Locard, using biological data captured from the Hive fleet, succeeded in developing a bioweapon, a plague that was delivered into the very heart of the Hive fleet by Ventris. The plague tore through the Hive ships, disrupting the synapse signals the Tyranids used to coordinate themselves, and leaving them easy prey for the Imperial fleets. But the collapse of the tendril assaulting the eastern fringe wasn't enough. There were still masses of Tyranids inbound in the Tempestus and Solar segmentums, and it was here that the Inquisitor, in an attempt to buy time, enacted the construction of a galactic cordon. Imperial worlds were to be abandoned in the path of the oncoming Hive Fleet and then burned clean of life, a scorched earth policy that would deny the Tyranids biomass to consume. Some worlds refused to evacuate, as with the Mechanicus Forge world of Griffon 4, whose legions of Skitari and Titans, aided by the evacuees from Tesla Prime, fought the monstrous bio-titans of Leviathan to the death, the world eventually being overrun and stripped of all resources. In other places, where there was no time to evacuate, Krypton used populated worlds as a lure, waiting until the Hive Fleet had devoted resources to an invasion of the planet before enacting Exterminatus and scorching the surface clean of all life with cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs. The plan worked, the main tendrils of Leviathan were slowed, but with these decisions, Krypton had condemned billions of souls to extermination, something that remained the single largest act of genocide inflicted on the Imperium by its own forces since the Horus Heresy. He was pulled up in front of a court of his peers, outraged by the abandonment of so many worlds to the enemy, and eventually Krypton was issued a Carta Extremis, stripped of his rank and title and forced into exile. But the former Inquisitor still had allies and had one more plan to put in motion. Inspired by the events at Tarsis Ultra and aided by the Space Marines of the Death Watch, Krypton succeeded in capturing a live gene stealer brood on the world of Carpathia and lodged them aboard the Space Hulk Perdition's Flame. Then, by destroying the moon of Geist, he redirected the Space Hulk into the nearby Orc-held Octarius sector. Sure enough, one of the tendrils of Leviathan was redirected, and it crashed into the Octarius sector at Orok, easily overwhelming the defenders. Dozens of worlds were soon swarming with Tyranids in a war that became the meat grinder, both the Orcs and the Tyranids throwing more and more of their forces into the colossal scrap. At Gorala, the pirate king of the Scar Fleet, Scarfang, fought swarms of bioships in the void until, when one broke through and ceded Gorala itself, the Orc fleet decamped to the surface for a proper fight. The war on Gorala ground on for months as the conflict shifted from first guerrilla warfare to then mass battles until, eventually, the hive mind generated and deployed lictors key to the elimination of Scarfang himself. When they finally succeeded, the Orcs of Gorala fell to infighting and were easy prey for a tendril now bolstered by Orc biomass. Krypton's gambit had been intended to weaken both parties, but what emerged was a tendril of Leviathan stronger than any other, slowly spreading through the rest of the Octarius sector. Finally, as Leviathan continued its inevitable rise up through the galactic plane, the largest tendrils ever recorded converged in the red scar surrounding the Blood Angels' chapter planet of Baal. The Cryptus system, a system of fortified shield worlds that guarded the approach to Baal, fell first, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers at play. Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, knew the chapter couldn't stand alone, but put out a call to the ancient successor chapters of the Blood Angels Legion. When the Tyranid fleet arrived at Baal, they found it defended not only by ships of the Blood Angels, but of the Flesh Tearers, Angels in Carmine, Blood Drinkers, Carmine Blades, and even renegade chapters like the Knights of Blood. The void erupted in a storm of fire as the Hive Fleet ploughed into the defenders, overwhelming each Imperial ship in turn as they fought their way onto the surface. War broke out across Baal as a carpet of bioorganisms threw themselves against the Blood Angels' defences, the primogenitors and their successors fighting back to back. The Swarm Lord appeared yet again, directing waves of Tyranids against the defenders. Over the course of a few weeks, 19 separate waves were repelled, 5 chapter masters of those successor chapters falling to the Endless Horde. It still wasn't enough. Baal was on the brink when it was saved by a different sort of calamity. It was around then that far away in the Segmentum Solar, Cadia fell to the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler, and the Great Rift first started to spread across the galaxy. Eventually, it reached Baal, tearing across the dark skies of the Red Scar and unleashing hordes of demons. The bloodthirster Ka'Bandha, ancient enemy of the Blood Angels, was affronted that any other species would take the honor of destroying his prey, and as the rift opened, his legions materialized on Baal and fell upon both attacker and defender alike. The demons swept across the rad-soaked plains, crushing termagants and genestealers beneath their cloven hooves, and causing the Space Marine defenders, led by Gabriel Seth of the Flesh Tearers, to fall back as Ka'Bandha laid about him with the Axe of Khorne. It was only a suicidal attack by the Knights of the Blood, lost to the Black Rage, that finally defeated the Bloodthirster and banished the demons. In orbit, the opening of the Great Rift had caused chaos within the Hive fleets. Leviathan's bioships were pulled screaming into the warp, swallowed by unreality or wounded by arcs of dark energy, and the Hive fleet was scattered, falling into disarray. But on the surface, the Blood Angels were still heavily outnumbered. Under the walls of their ancient fortress monastery, Dante dueled with this new swarm lord under a burning sky, finally falling to his wounds as he cut the head from the creature. But at that moment, the warp storms cleared and an Imperial fleet appeared in the sky. The first Crusade fleet of Robert Guillermin himself. The guns of the new Indomitus Crusade and the Primaris Space Marines deployed to the surface and finally tipped the balance, systematically eliminating the rest of Leviathan's ground forces as thousands of Primaris Marines, unnumbered sons of the lineage of Sanguinius, reinforced the defenders. It would take months to eliminate all the organisms on the surface, and many flared into the wastes where great piles of Tyranid skulls were found, the last remnant of the demonic invasion. But for now, the main tendrils of Leviathan had been defeated. Of course, as with all the incursions of the Hive fleets, that wasn't the end of the story. Leviathan had attacked across a front far larger than anything before, and while the main momentum of the assault had been halted at Tarsis, Octarius, and Baal, the Tyranids of Leviathan were still present across the galaxy in thousands of shattered fleets. Elements of Leviathan engaged the Red Corsairs in the heart of the Maelstrom, consumed the agri-world of Gorgo, and reached out from Octarius to overwhelm Bloodfall, homeworld of the Red Wolves chapter, with huge biotitans that it evolved during its battles against the Orcs. The Third Tyranic War might have ended with the emergence of the Great Rift, but the Imperium still had plenty of fires to put out across its domains, and as it turned out, the incursions of Hive Fleet Leviathan were far from over. And that brings us kind of up to date until the release of Warhammer 40k's 10th edition and the inevitable eruption of the 4th Tyranic War. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the events of Warhammer 40k, then click on the little link to the right there. You can also join the Patreon or the Discord for early access to videos and the ability to vote on the videos. And if you want to buy me some models, there's some affiliate links to stores in the thing below. See ya!